There are only 9 slides, but I think I'll take more time than both the speakers. So, as you are aware, friends, the natural history of type 2 diabetes, you are well aware that the problems arise much before than the frank onset of type 2 diabetes mellitus, and it is characterized by, as you know, two things. One is the early insulin resistance, and second is the vascular risk in dysglycemia continuum. So what it actually means is that most of the problems which happen in diabetes, actually they start happening in the pre-diabetic phase itself. So it is also known as the common soil hypothesis, or and this usually means that most of the complications, especially the macrovascular complications, they start happening even in the pre-diabetic phase. Hope it's okay now, Pankaj?
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So presentation of CV disease in patients with type 2 diabetes, and the proverbial, the tip of the iceberg is the known cardiovascular disease. 1 in 3 patients with type 2 diabetes have known CV disease, and the majority of the iceberg lies beneath the water, and that is the subclinical CV disease. 2 in 3 symptomatic patients with type 2 diabetes have subclinical CV disease, and the known CV disease, coronary artery disease, 1 in 5 patients, heart failure, 1 in 7 patients, and majorly presenting with coronary artery disease, and myocardial infarction, 1 in 10 patients. The subclinical CV disease, there is significant CAD in 2 in 5 patients, subclinical heart failure, 2 in 3 patients, and subclinical atherosclerosis, 2 in 3 patients, and pulseless lower limbs. As you know that there is a significant contribution of peripheral arterial disease in diabetics, 1 in 8 patients. So there is a manifest disease and there is a subclinical disease, and it applies both to the cardiovascular disease, but let me also add that it also applies to microvascular diseases also. Now, I am again stuck up, and why I am stuck up, I don't know. I think what I will do is, since I already know what my slides are, I would, yeah, okay, is it okay? The next slide?
Yes.
Yes, right. So I have already talked about the common soil for cardio-metabolic risk and the risk for CV events. It starts increasing much before the onset of type 2 diabetes. And this is some data from the Nurses Health Study, wherein we have evaluated the increasing risk for MI or stroke by diabetic status, and again, whether it is in the pre-diabetic phase or in the frank diabetic phase, the risk for the macrovascular complications starts actually in the pre-diabetic phase itself. And there is a high prevalence of CKD in the Indian population. Again, goes to show that we are actually dealing with the tip of the iceberg actually when we are dealing with macrovascular complications in our clinic. Coming to the microvascular complications, and the most important microvascular complication being nephropathy. There are nearly 59% of patients with type 2 diabetes in Indian OPDs who have varying extent of increased CKD risk. So whether it is macrovascular or the microvascular complication, the issue is the same, that we are dealing with a huge burden of the disease. Residual risk of CV death remains high despite absolute risk reduction in overall population. So what it actually means is that whatever interventions we do in diabetes and whatever improved efforts we make for risk factor control, there is still a significant residual risk of CV death, which remains very high in type 2 diabetes, and that is a cause for concern. So that brings us to this topic for today. the benefits of SGLT2 inhibition across cardiometabolic risk continuum, and that is what our two eminent speakers will allude to today. I would just give you an oversight that whatever strength of evidence we have today, all the SGLT2 inhibitors have a great role in heart failure, and that is why they have become key recommendations for all the international agencies. Clinically, there is a significant 25% reduction in heart failure hospitalizations and CV deaths, improved symptoms and quality of life. But there are still gaps. We know that there is a significant impact on patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, but we do not know what is the role of SGLT2 inhibitors in heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Trials are still going on and the data is still to be out. Significantly, with atherosclerotic disease, these group of drugs are suitable for patients with type 2 diabetes and CAD and stroke. We know that there is a lowered rate for MACE and heart failure hospitalizations. Initiations following acute MI, safety in peripheral arterial disease. In heart valve disease, there is some benefit similarly in atrial fibrillation, and in CKD we know that there is significant improvement and significant renal function preservation. In CKD, the gap is in the group of patients with EGFR less than 20, because it is a group of drugs which is still not recommended for that group of drugs, that group of patients. So finding the right balance for optimum patient value, the art of medicine is a matter of perspective, balancing need for monitoring versus improving clinical status, cost of offering CRM protection versus the cost of delaying organ protection, action post-event occurrence versus reducing the risk of events, and glucocentric approach versus patient-centric approach. So, two metabolic risk factors stand out, the cardiac and the renal. And the topic for today, friends, is the role of SGLT2 inhibition in these two important complications. We have two eminent speakers. I am just finished with my presentation. Extremely sorry for messaging up on my laptop. I'm very poor, as I said, on technology. And we have two eminent speakers. We have firstly Dr. Sen Gupta. Dr. Sen Gupta is a consultant in CR Park. He is an MD Medicine, a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians from Glasgow. He is also done his certification courses from multiple universities abroad. He is eminent diabetologist practicing in National Heart Institute at present. He is a dear friend, and I would request him to start his presentation on metabolic outcomes with SGLT2 inhibition, empowering the foundation of type 2 diabetes. And I hope he has a smooth presentation. Over to you, Dr. Sen Gupta.
Thank you, sir. I need you to stop your screen sharing, sir.
I am doing that. I am doing that. That is the only thing I can do. Well, yeah, I've done it.
Yeah. It's not getting. Is it visible?
No.
Sir, we can see your screen, sir. Just need to click on the PowerPoint.
No, just one second. What happened?
Then Gupta, you already have it minimized lower down. You look it down and open it. It is already minimized. Go down, go down, go down. Yes, this way.
Yeah, thank you. this is not, this upper bar is not letting me do a slideshow.
Sir, you can do it from bottom right corner as well.
There is a bottom right corner. There is ice cream cone. Next one. This one. No. The one too fast. Come back. Yes, this is the one. Click.
Yeah. Okay. So everyone faces these wishes. Anyhow. So thank you very much for inviting me to make this presentation. So after Dr. Chauhan has set the stage for the discussion, so let me go on to my topic, which is consideration of metabolic outcomes with SGLT2 inhibition. Now, we all know that over a period of the last decade, the SGLT2 inhibitors have literally revolutionized therapy in diabetes with its fantastic, effects on the atherosclerotic disease and chronic renal disease. And from initial skepticism and incredulousness, what we had seen as to how the pathology disease could be converted into the treatment, but we are now at a stage where it occupies a central stage in therapy across terms, and as Dr. Chauhan has also mentioned, it comes across the top of the recommendations of most clinical societies. So how is it important in the Indian patient? So let's have a quick look at the background. Let me allude to this very seminal paper by Dr. Yajnik et al. When he talked about the thin fat Indian and the metabolic risk of type 2 diabetes. So, in comparison of patients of diabetes from India and UK, Indian patients are diagnosed at a younger age, have less generalized obesity and thinner limbs, but higher adiposity and higher central adiposity. More insulin resistance, as has been determined by various Homer scores. Now, if you see that the age at diagnosis of a typical Indian diabetic is approximately 10 years lesser. The body mass index, though being lesser compared to the European counterpart, the disease affects us much earlier. Even if the mid-arm circumference relating to obesity, etc., is lesser, the disease affects us earlier. The waist-hip ratio overall is about 5% more. The subscapular muscle to triceps thickness is about 20% more. The fat percent is about 30% more, and overall insulin resistance, unfortunately, is approximately 1.5 times more. So if you see that the effects of the oral glucose lowering therapies on the various cardiometabolic risk factors which are commonly taken into consideration across the spectrum, if you see the factors like glycemia control, a low risk of hypoglycemia, which is very essential in therapy for diabetes, weight loss, blood pressure reduction, and lipid profile, SGLT2 inhibitors actually ticks all the boxes with favorable outcomes, meaning that you can achieve a good glycemia control with a low risk of hypoglycemia, a good weight loss compared to the other drugs like sulfonylureas or the TZDs, a reasonable blood pressure reduction initially as we can see, and it's more or less neutral on the lipid profile to a favorable profile in some patients. So, what are the potential clinical benefits and how does the SGLT2 inhibition work? We know the primary effect is by glucose lowering, which reduces microvascular morbidity, decreases glucotoxicity, and has a low risk of hypoglycemia, as I've already alluded to. Insulin independent mechanism. So it has the ability to work at all stages of the disease, can be combined with other classes of antihypoglycemics. And very importantly, as this states, since it is different from the mechanistic pathways of the other drugs, this can be utilized at any stage of the disease commensurate with the clinical considerations. Osmotic diuresis, which helps in the initial weight loss with a decrease in blood pressure, as I've already mentioned. Loss of excess calories in the urine, which can cause a sustained weight loss provided the patient is also careful enough. And the mitigation of weight gain from other classes of antihypoglycemics if the patient is again careful enough and the proper monitoring is done. So at progressive baseline, HbA1c, SGLT2 inhibition demonstrates a steeper decline in HbA1c compared to DPP4 inhibition. As you can see across the three baseline HbA1cs of 8%, 9% and 10%, a dose of empagliflozin 25 milligrams daily fares much better than sitagliptin, which is the prototype DPP4 inhibitor, and it's significantly higher efficacy with empagliflozin versus sitagliptin was observed in this trial. And for every 1% increase in the baseline HbA1c, the corresponding HbA1c reduction at 24 weeks was significantly better with empagliflozin versus glimepiride on a baseline of metformin in type 2 diabetes when we are considering empagliflozin as a prototype SGLT2 inhibitor. And it was shown that there was a sustained glycemia control over 4 years with an 89% lower risk of hypoglycemia. As you can see in the graph out here, the effect was continued over a period of 4 years. And as you can see that the graph separation continued consistently. Also, the risk glycemic event was almost 9 times lesser, which was very significant. It also has a good role in keeping the sugar control when observed in 24 hours continuous glucose monitoring. When it was in a small study which was seen out here, as you can see with empagliflozin usage of 10 milligrams and empagliflozin usage of 25 milligrams from day 1 to day 28, considering the comparison with placebo, there was almost an 81% follow-up in the time in range in continuous glucose monitoring vis-a-vis the placebo, which was at 59.4% only, as you can observe in the right-hand side of the panel. Now, time in range is a concept which has come to stay in diabetes management, in which we try to keep the sugar, the blood sugar, within 70% of the time during the day, which is approximately 17 hours, in the range of 70 to 180 milligram percent, which has been corroborated with lesser risk of atherosclerotic and decrease of cardiorenal risk. Also, weight loss with empagliflozin is maintained over 4 years, as it was demonstrated in this study vis-a-vis glimepiride. Also, with glimepiride, as you can see in the initial period, in the initial few weeks, there was an increase in weight, but it gradually stabilized to a level of approximately about 1 kilo weight gain. But the difference was significant in comparison when we consider empagliflozin, which caused a significant weight loss of approximately 5 kilograms, and which was maintained over a period of 4 years, which is very significant because this is a very important part of diabetes management. And empagliflozin versus glimepiride as add-on to metformin in type 2 diabetics, we could see that there is a significant improvement in visceral adiposity. At about 104 weeks, the total fat mass decreased by about 2.5% with empagliflozin vis-a-vis glimepiride. And 90% of the weight loss with empagliflozin was due to fat mass loss. But this is again very significant. Abdominal visceral adipose tissue decreased by about 33.7 centimeters square, and the abdominal subcutaneous adipose tissue by about 67 centimeters square, and a waist circumference reduction of about almost 4 centimeters, which is highly significant, which we meaning about a 1.5 inch of waist circumference reduction. If you can see that the empagliflozin has an action on the metabolism vis-a-vis the white and brown adipose tissue, the SGLT2 inhibitor, it causes glucosuria, which causes an increase in the fibroblast growth factor 21 expression. Also, glucosuria causes a decrease in the glucose and also consequently a decrease in the insulin production. Now, how does this affect the metabolism? The activated protein kinase, as you can see in the top panel, gets activated with acetyl-CoA carboxylase activation, which causes increased acid oxidation and then consequently increased energy expenditure. Also, FGF21 is a hepatokine which is secreted, and it via FGF21 receptors in the paraventricular nucleus of the brain, it causes brain signaling to decrease the carbohydrate intake, also causes uptake of glucose by adipose tissue, and alters the taste perception, leading to a reduction in the glucose load. So via this, as you can see, it also causes decrease of lipogenesis and increases the beta oxidation in the liver. The M2 macrophages get activated, which are anti-inflammatory, and with the help of the uncoupling protein 1, the UCP1 as it is mentioned in the white adipose tissue, which is a thermogenin, which causes non-shivering heat production and weight loss. Also, it stimulates the brown adipose tissue to cause thermogenesis. All this causes an increase in energy expenditure, consequently decrease in obesity, consequently decrease in ectopic fat accumulation, decrease inflammation, and decrease insulin resistance. So with one drug, you have multiple pleiotropic effects which are affecting the metabolism in a very, very positive manner. Also, empagliflozin versus glimepiride on a baseline therapy of metformin in patients with diabetic, it has been shown to improve insulin resistance indices significantly. One of the insulin indices that we see is the TIG index, the triglyceride glucose index, in which empagliflozin fared significantly better than glimepiride. Though it was a small study, but the change in baseline was significant at about a month's time itself. And as you can see in the lower panel, the fasting triglycerides decreased much more significantly compared to glimepiride with the usage of empagliflozin. And also the fasting glucose was also reduced significantly. On the right hand panel, as you can see, HOMA-IR, which is one of the standard denominators of insulin resistance that is calculated. In the same study, it was shown that the baseline change with empagliflozin was much better, and it was significantly better than glimepiride over a period of 30 days. Empagliflozin also reduced adipose tissue inflammation vis-a-vis sitagliptin as an add-on to metformin in patients with diabetes. Small study again of about 106 patients, though the drop in HbA1c was more or less comparable if you see the right-hand panel. The rise in serum adiponectin, which is a very important indicator for adipose tissue inflammation, it has a positive effect, which is was significantly higher with empagliflozin compared to sitagliptin. Also, preliminary evidence suggests that histological improvement in NASH occurs in type 2 diabetics after 6 months of treatment. If you see across the panel, all the bars are ticked in favor of empagliflozin. Vis-a-vis placebo, there was improvement in steatosis, lobular inflammation, hepatocellular ballooning, NASH resolution without worsening of fibrosis, direct improvement of fibrosis, and in fact resolution of fibrosis also in a small number of patients, and the progression of cirrhosis in the empagliflozin group was 0. Also, beta cell function was seen to improve with empagliflozin therapy. In the hypoglycemic clamp study, which is a standard study protocol which was devised by DiFronzo and Tobin in 1979, the plasma C-peptide response was measured, which is basically a function of, a denominator of the beta cell function. And across the board of, glucose infusion, as it was seen, as the concentration went up in the hypoglycemic clamp study, the plasma C-peptide response was considerably high with empagliflozin. Also, there was a 59% lowering in insulin requirement, and also a 57% decrease in the requirement of, increase of insulin dosage in this study, which was an offshoot of EMPA-REG outcome, which was a subset analysis which was done. As you can see, over a period of approximately 1440 days, the new insulin initiation vis-a-vis placebo was significantly lower in the pooled empagliflozin group. Also, the requirement for increase of insulin by about 20% was almost 57% less, which was highly significant. And the risk of new onset obstructive sleep apnea was 52% lower with empagliflozin versus placebo in patients with type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Very importantly, mediation statistical analysis could explain only 20% of this overall benefit, and which was supposed to be because of changes in weight, systolic blood pressure, hematocrit and HbA1c, meaning that almost 78% there was something else also which was there, still not decipherable, which was causing this highly significant improvement in the risk of new onset of sleep apnea. Summary, SGLT2 inhibition has foundational relevance in addressing several metabolic defects in patients with type 2 diabetes, namely visceral adiposity, insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, beta cell function, fasting and postprandial glycemia, and obviously the need for a 24-hour glucose profile, and a significant improvement in metabolic effects, and may have several pertinent clinical implications in patients with type 2 diabetes. Just a couple of days ago, I saw a news feed that empagliflozin has now been recommended for, after dapagliflozin and even non-diabetic heart failure. So that's the extent of improvement that we have seen. So what is the story so far? In management of blood glucose, avoidance of obesity, treatment of comorbidities like obesity, hypertension, and being kind of, more for lifestyle modification, etc., which was the buzzwords in the management of diabetes in the earlier days. Along came SGLT2 inhibitors, which have kind of revolutionized therapy. So the recommendations came through in 2013 to use SGLT2 inhibitors with caution as a third or fourth line agent, which were postulated by the major medical and diabetic associations. Over a period of time, some 2018 recommendations that if ASCVD and CKD or heart failure predominance in the patient, please use SGLT2 inhibitors directly after metformin. So that was the kind of center stage that it has occupied. So what do the 2020 and 21 guidelines recommend? Latest evidence, one I have already told to you, which has just come in a few days ago on the basis of the Emperor reduced trial. Very importantly, the ACE and the ACE recommendations say that the SGLT2 recommendations are there independent of glycemic control in high CV patients, not just in the CVD group. So from an initial period of when we were skeptics about usage of SGLT2 inhibitors across the board, now is the stage where it is used in practically everything, and we are actually waiting for other kinds of also pleiotropic benefits to be unraveled by this wonderful group of drugs, and it has come to occupy a very major, as I say, my favorite word, center stage in the management of diabetes. And in the consideration of clinical, status of the patients that we see, it is a highly significant and important molecule. So thank you very much for a patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Sen, for a wonderful presentation on the empowering the metabolic outcomes with SGLT2 inhibition with the foundational role, and I think you have brought out the point very well regarding the emerging, I would say, role now. It's no longer emerging. I think it is now quite well established, the role of SGLT2 inhibitors. And to me, the greatest advantage of this group of drugs has been to bridge the gap between the micro and the macrovascular outcomes. We know that all these years there was very impressive results with the established anti-diabetics on the microvascular outcomes, but there was not much to take home about the macrovascular outcomes. So the greatest advantage after the SGLT2 inhibition story has been the bridging of the gap between the SGLT2 inhibitors and the macrovascular and the microvascular outcomes. So what I want to emphasize is that the story is still emerging and we are still not done with it. What I would like to say now is that I'd like to move with the next presentation, and that is managing atherosclerotic CVD and heart failure risk in type 2 diabetes with SGLT2 inhibitors. I am sure all of you are aware that the common ground of all SGLT2 inhibitors agrees on one point, and that is that all of them are very good on heart failure front, and there is no controversy there. So to take the story further, I would request Dr. Rajiv Gupta. Dr. Rajiv Gupta, some of you who are members of the Physician Forum of India may not be aware about the credentials of Dr. Rajiv Gupta sir. Dr. Rajiv Gupta is a physician of eminence from East Delhi. He is a consulting physician practicing for more than 35 years. He is a past president and co-founder of Delhi Diabetic Forum. Sir is a past president of East Delhi Physician Forum. Contributed chapters in several books, co-authors of textbooks of medical emergencies, and devised PG certificate course in clinical diabetes for AK and Sinha Institute for IMA headquarters in Delhi. I request Dr. Rajiv Gupta sir to give his talk on managing ASCVD and heart failure risk in type 2 diabetes with SGLT2 inhibitors. Learning from Emperor. Over to you, Dr. Rajiv Gupta.
Thank you, Dr. Chauhan, for a very nice presentation. The first to from the introduction, and also for thanking words of appeal. So we all have please.
Pankaj, please ask people to mute.
So as Dr. Chauhan has said, that diabetes mellitus is a major risk factor for CVD, 2 to 4 more times common than the general population, because it leads to heart failure independent of age, independent of gender, coronary artery disease, hypertension, etc. So that is why it is considered to be a cardiovascular risk equivalent. Next slide. In India too, we find that the global burden of TB tests has definitely increased over the years. In 1990, it was considered to be 15% of the total deaths, overall deaths, and now in 2016, it is 28% of the deaths, overall deaths. So TB death has become a very important factor as far as the Indian population is concerned. Next slide. Next. So the EMPA-REG outcome study represents a key milestone for the microvascular and mortality risk reduction in patients with type 2 diabetes and CV disease. And now you see that in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, the EMPA-REG outcome study was a landmark study, and it showed that it conferred early and sustained reduction in the risk of CV death. So if you see in this graph here, there was a total 38% relative risk reduction in the overall study population, while it's very interesting that amongst the Asian patients who were in that study, there was a 56% reduction in the relative risk for CV death. So that's a very important point which is to be noticed in this EMPA-REG outcome study. Next slide. And what is interesting is that empagliflozin consistently reduced the risk of CV death regardless of the CV manifestation. Whether the persons were having single vessel disease or a multi-vessel disease, or there was a history of bypass surgery, or there was a history of prior MI. In all the conditions, the patients who were put on empagliflozin, there was a definite reduction in the risk. You can see in the graph single vessel reduction by 4%, Then in multi-vessel disease, 3.3%, CABG 3%, prior MI 4.6%, as compared to the placebo, which is seen in the black column. Next slide. Similarly, with the other factors also, like if there's a peripheral artery disease, or there's a prior stroke, or there's a prior heart failure, or there's a history of atrial fibrillation, in all these conditions, there was reduction in the incidence by using empagliflozin as compared to placebo in this study. Next slide. And another important part was that whether the patient had heart failure or they did not have heart failure, empagliflozin consistently reduced the risk of CV death in all the patients. With heart failure, you can see there was a reduction by 10.4% compared to 15.3% in placebo, while with patients without heart failure also, there was a reduction of 2.7% compared to 4.2% in the placebo. Next. Another important point, something which was later studied, that was that empagliflozin may reverse LV remodeling in patients with CAD and type 2 diabetes mellitus. There was reduction in LV mass index, there was reduction in LV extracellular volume fraction, and this was even in patients who had previous MI, and there also, and this was independent of the systolic BP reduction or independent of the volume reduction, which is usually seen with the empagliflozin in these patients. So that is a very interesting study and very important advantage of using empagliflozin in patients with CAD and type 2 diabetes. Next slide. Another pleiotropic effect was the increase in erythropoiesis, something which was not seen in any other anti-diabetic medication. And what empagliflozin does is that it increases the erythropoiesis in the kidney and thus improve the hematocrit and thus improve the oxygen supply to the heart. So all these factors, they have increased the hemoglobin levels, they have reduced the anemia and improved the cardiac output. Next slide. And apart from the health reduction in the heart failure, there was a 21% risk in the myocardial infarction event in patients who were put on empagliflozin versus placebo. And in this chart, one can see that there was reduction in major adverse events, CV events, myocardial infarction, and a reduction in the myocardial infarction or coronary revascularization. And this is something which is unique to the empagliflozin and not seen with any other SGLT2 inhibitor. Next slide. So, by treating 11 patients with atherosclerotic CVD disease and type 2 diabetes, one additional CV event can be prevented in 3 years. So, one can see in this chart also and in this diagram that there were 4,687 patients which were treated with empagliflozin over a period of 3.1 years. And estimated total CV events prevented was 414. So hence the number of patients needed to treat over 3 years to prevent one additional CV event was 10.2. So, and all the total CV events were considered were first and recurrent MI, stroke, coronary revascularization, hospitalization for unstable angina, transient ischemic attack, heart failure, and CV death. So this is another very important aspect of this drug, empagliflozin. Next slide. So here all the various mechanisms or various benefits which have been put up on this slide. 100 patients with diabetes and CVD treated with empagliflozin in 3 years. The benefit, there was 9.8 reduction of CV events, 8.5 reduction in CKD events, 3.5 reduction in AKI and ARF, hyperkalemia events, then 12.9 reduction in the insulin requirement, then 5.1 additional systolic BP goal achieved in patients with registered hypertension. There was reduced edema and the prevention of the new obstructive sleep apnea event, 5.5, and similarly increase in the total life years by 3.4 years. So multiple benefits with just one drug. Next slide. So we talk about lots of CVOT trials, and there are now several CVOT trials with SGLT2 inhibitors in type 2 diabetes mellitus, and the most famous ones being EMPA-REG outcome Canvas program, Declare TV, Credence, and then Vertus TV with the various SGLT2 inhibitors, namely empagliflozin, canagliflozin, dapagliflozin, canagliflozin, and atogliflozin. Out of these, the EMPA-REG, Canvas, Declare, and Credence made a huge noise because they had a large number of patients with them, and they were also quite successful trials. But if you see, there were kind of patients were different in all the different trials. While in EMPA-REG and Vertus, they were established 100% CV disease patients, while in the Canvas program or in the Declare Credence trial, they were also patients who did not have CV disease, or they had some heart failure only, or they had some kidney problem only, or some of them also did not have any of the cardiac or kidney problems also. Next slide. The MACE risk reduction with SGLT2 was important, but it is inconsistent across various SGLT2 inhibitors and also across various study populations, because again, the study population, the patients were different in the different trials. Like in the previous slide I showed that only two programs or two study programs had 100% CVD suffering patients included in the trial, while in the other trials they were different kind of patients. But somehow you can broadly group them in patients with atherosclerotic CV disease and patients without atherosclerotic CV disease. And here you can see the EMPA-REG outcome as well as the Canvas program both shows favorable response as far as treatment is concerned compared to the other ones, especially like Vertus TV, where again the benefits were less consistent as compared to EMPA-REG. Similarly, there was a question whether these drugs will be helpful in patients who don't have atherosclerotic heart disease, and there was a lot of controversy on it, and there were several trials in which we find that Canvas and Declare, they just showed the neutral effect, while Credence showed definitely beneficial effect even with patients without atherosclerotic heart disease. But then all these trials, they definitely showed improvement in the heart failure study. Next slide. Next slide. Next. So here, the hospitalization for heart failure, there was risk reduction in all the SGLT trials, and one can see that even with atherosclerotic heart disease, like the EMPA-REG, the Declare, Credence, Canvas, all of them showed favorable response with the SGLT2 inhibitors in preventing heart failure. And patients even without atherosclerotic heart disease, there again, the Canvas and Declare study, and they showed that there was definite improvement in prevention in the heart failure risk. Next slide. So all the CVOTs have definitely shown improvement in CV outcomes, whether it is EMPA-REG, whether it is Canvas, whether it is Declare, whether it is Vertus. But the most important thing is the prevention of the cardiovascular death. They've all prevented major adverse CV events, but cardiovascular death was maximally reduced with EMPA-REG as compared to Canvas or as compared to Vertus CV. While heart failure study, again, hospitalization for heart failure was equally good as with the other SGLT2 inhibitors, namely EMPA-REG, Canvas, or Declare or Vertus. Next. So what does the new ADS standards of care say for the 2021? They have all recommended the various SGLT2 inhibitors, and depending on the disease of the patient, whether they have got atherosclerotic heart disease, whether they have got heart failure, or whether they have got chronic renal failure, depending on that, they have classified these SGLT2 inhibitors. And patients with ASCVD, the drugs which have been, or SGLT2 inhibitors which have been recommended are empagliflozin and canagliflozin. And while the other SGLT2 inhibitors like Cana or DAPA, they are neutral as far as heart failure is concerned, or ASCVD is concerned, and of course in diabetic kidney disease, the canagliflozin and EMPA and DAPA have got a significant role as far as the prevention of kidney failure is concerned. So here you can see the comparison with SGLT2 inhibitors and as well as GLP-1 antagonists. Here also one can see that amongst them SGLT2 inhibitors have a better profile as far as compared to GLP-1. Among the GLP-1, the only drugs which have been approved are dulaglutide, liraglutide, and semaglutide. So, as far as the heart failure is concerned, they don't have any effect on the heart failure, the GP1RA, and they have some benefits from they have been shown benefits in the CVOT trials, but yet their use is restricted because most of them are effective. Next slide. So here comes the more important thing, that is the Emperor Reduce trial, which was studied on patients with reduced ejection fraction. And again, with two important trials like Emperor Reduced and DAPA heart failure trials, it was seen that even in patients with reduced ejection fraction, the empagliflozin had significant benefit, and similarly was of dapagliflozin. And more interesting was that even with patients without diabetes also, there was a reduction in the heart failure rate, even in those patients who had reduced ejection fraction and without diabetes. Both the drugs, Emperor as well as DAPA, empagliflozin as well as the dapagliflozin, they showed benefit, and so now they have been approved even for use in patients without diabetes, as Dr. Sen Gupta was saying. Next slide. What is interesting was that in the Emperor Reduced trial, where empagliflozin was used, the clinical benefits were seen as early as even day 12, which is very interesting. You see, in the EMPA outcome study, there the results started coming after about 15 to 20 days or after a month, and then you can see the widening of the gap between the placebo and the empagliflozin. But here in the reduced ejection fraction patients, the difference could be seen even after just 12 days of therapy, and that is very, very encouraging for patients who have reduced ejection fraction, and we are at a loss as how to treat them in our clinical cases. Next. So what is now the recommendation of the European Society of Cardiology, which recently they come out with this recommendation in heart failure, especially the heart failure section of the ESCA. They said that canagliflozin, dapagliflozin, empagliflozin or atugliflozin have consistently demonstrated to be effective in the prevention of heart failure hospitalization in patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus and established CV disease or at high CV risk. And all these agents are now recommended as to reduce the risk of heart failure hospitalization. Especially dapagliflozin or empagliflozin are recommended for the combined risk of heart failure hospitalization and CV death in symptomatic patients with heart failure and reduced ejection fraction, who are already receiving the maximum guideline-directed medical therapy, regardless even if they are not diabetic. So this is a very important recommendation by the European Society of Cardiology. And so now this drug, empagliflozin, which was initially launched as an anti-diabetic drug, has now become an anti-heart failure drug also, and an equally good cardiac drug, and now being used both by cardiologists and as well as the diabetologists. Next slide. Thank you. I think that is the end of the slide. Thank you for a very patient listening. I have been rather quick about it because I think all of us are waiting for the dinner now. So any questions, most welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Rajiv Gupta, sir, for a wonderful presentation. I think we had two lovely presentations from Dr. Sen Gupta and Dr. Rajiv Gupta. My humble request to the audience is to ask some relevant questions. Dr. Sen Gupta's son has his birthday today, so we wish him a very, very happy birthday. And the budding doctor. will be into his second year soon. I think he's already into his second year now. And therefore, if there are any questions, I would like to ask Dr. Sen. Dr. Sen, have you been using empagliflozin personally, and what is your experience with it, sir?
I've been using it, quite frequently, and the experience has been extremely good. And you just have to. The only thing that I see, checked out is, apart from the other clinical recommendations and the indications that you have to check. Obviously, the age factor beyond 75, I don't try. I'm a little, conservative in that. Other than that, as per the indications, I've used it extensively, and it's been a good experience as such.
Okay. Do you see the drug moving up in the recommendations chart of ADA and EASD in the years to come? Maybe sulfonylureas will be very soon replaced by SGLT2 inhibitors. I think in some recommendations it has already been. Your take on that?
See, it has already moved up the chart in the almost, it's a tier 2 drug totally, irrespective of the ASCVD risk, as I said, then you have to stratify the risk considerations and start the drug. Absolutely. Now, whether in the Indian context, personally speaking, I don't think sulfonylureas will go out of practice. If not for, from the science part, at least from the, the cost part of it, and they are wonderful drugs to be used, and there has been a relook at the usage and the toxicities or, the so-called side effects of sulfonylureas, and we have all been doing presentations on that also. So I think they are going to stay. Now, SGLT2 inhibitors have definitely moved up the ladder, and the only addition that can be done is that maybe there can be a recommendation in the future that, in considering the clinical status of the patient and the risk factors, whether it should be started straight away with metformin rather than after metformin. So I would like Dr. Rajiv sir also to comment on that. That seems to be the last frontier of types. It's already there as tier 2 after metformin for all the clinical risk factors, etc. So whether it should be started in addition, along with metformin straight away rather than waiting for anything else, that's there. We do start it together. Obese diabetics with the cardiorenal risk, it can be started together, and I do so in certain cases.
Lalit, I think you have a question.
I just wanted to know whether it can be used in obstructive sleep apnea. I heard it someone saying that. Obstructive sleep apnea.
I think there is no contraindication, Lalit, of using SGLT2 inhibitors. In fact, they would be of help because they would help reduce weight. They will achieve a good metabolic control. So anything which reduces weight and achieves a good metabolic control, I think would always be of help. So
I showed you the slide where it has, in fact, usage of SGLT2 inhibitors has led to reduced occurrence of obstructive sleep apnea in a certain setting of patients.
Yeah, but I wanted to point out something.
Yeah.
I'd like to point out that it has not been approved for use as a standalone treatment for obstructive sleep apnea. It's only in patients who have got diabetes and as well as atherosclerotic heart disease.
Yeah.
And of course, there is another point where Dr. Sen was saying regarding the use as a first-line drug or a second-line drug. I don't know if you listened to Deep Renzo's lecture just a week or 10 days back. Yeah? There he had recommended to be used as a first-line drug.
Right.
Okay. But I would like to say one thing, that there are no very good trials which say that SGLT2 inhibitors have done their job well in patients without atherosclerotic heart disease. It is Vertis trial or even some other trials, they have not shown some big benefit of using SGLT2 inhibitors in patients with diabetes who don't have any atherosclerotic heart disease. They have not prevent heart attacks, they have not prevent MI, they have not prevent stroke. So that way, it's a little wishful thinking that we can use it as a first-line drug.
Sir, agreed. Dr. Rajiv, I wanted your take on the fact that India remains by far a country with a very, very large diabetic disease burden. And I think it will take some time before we are able to, replace the standard combination of metformin and then sulfonylureas. But given the fact that SGLT2 inhibitors are very promising in bridging the micro and the macrovascular divide, do you think sulfonylureas getting replaced by SGLT2 inhibitors, especially the cheaper ones? I will not like to name them in the years to come, sir. Your take on this?
I think in India what we require is a polytherapy. No one drug will do. In fact, we have to address the individual pathogenic mechanisms responsible for each patient. So we have to individualize the therapy. A person who is a lean, thin patient, he may probably benefit with sulfonylurea also. But if it is an obese patient, maybe their sulfonylurea may not be of much use. But what we require is a polypharmacy, like use 3 or 4 combinations to address all the various issues. So that's what I feel, because as far as the HbA1c reduction capability is concerned, all these drugs, they don't reduce the HbA1c by more than 1%.
Yeah. I don't think we should be talking about replacement of sulfonylureas. They have their own standard place in therapy, and as Dr. Rajiv just mentioned, I mean, you just have to make a judicious mix and see, as per the clinical risk and the clinical stratification of the patient, what to use and when. So I don't go by the, adage that sulfonylureas will be replaced. And I personally believe, like I said, I've already mentioned, they will not be, stopped whatsoever totally in the Indian context at least. I don't know about the West, but sulfonylureas have their own defined places. So let's not go into, whether they would be replaced. Maybe in terms of, clinical indications up and there, they would be, maybe taken as second line or whatever. But they have their own place in therapy.
Dr. Sen and Dr. Rajiv, any one of you can answer this question. We had a very bad second wave of COVID in India, and a lot of our diabetic patients had their blood sugars going haywire. What was your strategy during the second wave of pandemic, sir? Did you try and stop their existing doses of SGLT2 inhibitors? Maybe introduce insulin, or just advise your patients to continue with SGLT2 inhibitors and take care of their hydration? Your take on that, sir, Dr. Rajiv Gupta.
You see, it depends. The patients who are hospitalized, there, of course, we had to stop the SGLT2 inhibitors completely. And in other class of patients who were treated at home, there, if their diabetes status was good, then we continued with SGLT2 also. But then, if they were not on DP4 inhibitors, I added a DP4 inhibitor. And insulin was used in those patients who were on steroids, and steroids was causing increase in their blood sugar level.
Your take, Dr. Sen?
I was a little more conservative in the sense that I use sulfonylureas and insulin only. Though people have said to continue until unless the patient is hospitalized, but I had this constant fear whether they would cause kind of background myopathy, because this was something which was causing havoc everywhere, so we did not know how the other newer drugs would also be there. And even with DPP4 inhibitor, there was always this basic nagging doubt of inhibition of other DPP4 enzymes, whether they were beneficial or not. So I just tried to play it safe, and I would wait for more evidence to come in. From my side, what I did was just sulfonylurea and insulin titration. That is what.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I hand over the podium to Dr. S.K. Mathur, sir, I can see him attending to the talk very, very assiduously. Sir, there has been lot of talk about the euglycemic diabetic ketoacidosis with SGLT2 inhibitors. I have been using SGLT2 inhibitors ever their inception in India. I did not have any major issues about this glycemic diabetic ketoacidosis, especially if you are careful about choosing your patients. Have you encountered euglycemic diabetic ketoacidosis in your practice? Dr. Rajiv Gupta, sir?
Yes. And in fact, I've lost one patient also because of that.
Sir, what was the setting? Could you
The setting was basically septicemia. Both the times actually what happened was that the patients were also on insulin and they were on SGLT2 inhibitors also. And what they did was, because they developed fever, high-grade fever, infection, one of them developed severe diarrhea. So what he did was he stopped the insulin and continued with the SGLT2 inhibitors. And and when they reached me, that was quite late. They were already in shock, and we couldn't manage them, even in spite of knowing the reason why this thing has occurred. So only one of them was saved, the other one died.
Your take on that, Dr. Sen? Euglycemic.
I've had exactly 4 cases such, but luckily I'm in the setting of dehydration and infection only. But luckily all 4 were salvaged because we got them at the earliest stages. One was a referred case, the other 3 were my own patients.
I request Dr. S.K. Mathur, sir, with his vast experience of treating diabetes, thyroid, comorbidities, sir, your take on your use of SGLT2 inhibitors.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Sushil, for putting me on board. I'd like to thank Dr. Gupta and Dr. Sen Gupta for lovely talk. They updated us on the SGLT2 inhibitors. SGLT2 inhibitors is the day of the order nowadays in type 2 diabetes mellitus. We all are using very, very regularly, but the only constant still remains the cost factor, the first line of drug. We do use very, very regularly, but nonetheless, it's still not the first line of drug. Sulfonylurea and metformin remains there. But anyway, it is a wonderful drug, and we are really updated by your expert, experience and opinion, and how to and when to use it with all its pleomorphic effects, and that is a wonderful. My one take on oral COVID-19, I would say, these 2 which we have recently gone by, which were definitely very, very sad. We have lost a lot of friends and colleagues and a lot of people. But nonetheless, still we have to be very guarded, as Dr. Sen Gupta said at the beginning. The phase 3, break 3 can come soon or later. We don't know whether it's going to come or not, but we all should remain guarded. That's what Sen Gupta was saying in the beginning of the talk, and we really need to be there. Once again, thank you, Sushil, and thank you, sir, for a lovely talk which we have been enlightened by use of SGLT2 inhibitors. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.